What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video, and today we are talking FPL tips for the 2020-21 season. So the idea of this video is to talk about 8 things that I've kind of learned from just past experience, but also from last season, and try and put them into practice this season for a higher rank finish. As we all know, that doesn't always work out. We can't always get a high finish every single season, but hopefully these things will help me do it, and maybe you guys can apply it to your kind of seasons as well, or maybe you've got your own. If you have your own tips that I've missed, make sure to leave them in the comments below once you've watched the full video. If you enjoy it, give it a like, and if you're new around here, subscribe. We've hit 75k now. Thanks very much to everyone that's subscribed. The aim is, of course, now 100k. I'm sure we can do it by the end of this season. Otherwise, let's jump into the video. So before we jump into the actual tips, I thought I'd quickly talk about my FPL history. Not to kind of say, look how good it is, not to say, look how bad it is. Like, some people will think it's good, some people will think it's bad, some will just say it's fine, it's okay, and I'd probably be somewhere in the middle there. But because this is what kind of spurred the idea for this video. Now, I always do some kind of video like this every single season, but last year was a particularly bad rank, well, I really need to fix that this year. So overall, I've done okay. I think there's a few bad ones in there, 104k, 92k, and obviously last year was my worst. So I'm coming off the back of that now, trying to hit it hard this year, both on YouTube and from an FPL rank point of view. Obviously, for those of you that watched me last year, you know I got hacked and stuff, but ultimately, I don't think that was the be-all and end-all for having a bad rank. There was just some bad decisions made. So I just wanted to show this because people are always interested. I don't really hide it away. I don't necessarily show it on every single video either. But 162k, I must do better. I really want another top 10k finish. At the very least, another top 20k finish. Obviously, there's so many more people playing FPL. And to do that, there's some tips I've got for myself that hopefully you guys will be able to make use of as well. Let's jump into them. So the first one is no goalkeeper transfers. Now, this doesn't obviously mean I'm never ever going to transfer a goalkeeper. What I mean is, if it's not a wild card, it's not a free hit, or there isn't an injury to my goalkeeper, I'm not going to look at changing them around. And the reason for that is I did that last year. So Nick Pope, the man on screen, the guy that scored the most amount of FPL points for goalkeepers last year, I had him at the start of the season. He didn't perform well for like 15, 20 weeks, something like that. And I decided to get rid of him. Burnley weren't keeping enough clean sheets. I swapped him to another goalkeeper. That didn't work out. I then got an injury, swapped to a different one. And later on in the season, I got another goalkeeper injury. So I think with these tips, some of it is not to look at it as hindsight. If you bring a player in and they get injured, that's not necessarily a bad decision. But when you take a player out who's done consistently well when they've played regular minutes, just because they hadn't done well for the first 15, 20 weeks, I mean, they still picked up points, of course, but it doesn't mean they're not going to do that for the rest of the season. And ultimately, the other issue I kind of have with goalkeeper transfers are they very rarely get a huge amount of points. Like, again, I've talked about this on other videos. Nick Pope got 170 points last year. Matt Ryan got 135. Yes, 35 points is quite a big difference if you get that decision right. But with wildcards and stuff, you don't have to keep the goalkeeper for the whole season anyway. So the ceiling, the most amount of points a goalkeeper can get each week is usually quite low. You're looking at 6 or 7 points. Sometimes you get like a 9-pointer when they get bonus points, even more if they get a penalty save. But really, 6 or 7 points is the max. So the difference between getting the keeper right or wrong is very small. And there's always chance of a kind of cheaper keeper clawing back the points with the odd random clean sheet here or there. So for me, no goalkeeper transfers this year. Wildcard, free hit, injuries is going to be the only time I'm looking to make those transfers. So number 2 is don't waste transfers. Now this sounds pretty obvious, right? You shouldn't waste any transfers. They're kind of precious. Any more that you need to make cost you 4 points. But hear me out about what I'm kind of, or what my thinking is around this. So last season in particular, one player, Trent Alexander-Arnold, performing pretty well. Liverpool defence didn't do as well as we thought at the start, but ultimately they kept picking up points. And by the end of the season, a bit like Nick Pope, he was a huge scorer, right? For just 7 million that he was priced last year, 7.5 this year. And yet I decided that he was the transfer out that I needed to make. And he got a 24 point in the next week. Now, that's a bit of hindsight, but even after that, he continued to get points. And I think the learning from that I want to take into next season is, if you've got consistent performers, like people like Trent Alexander-Arnold, maybe it's a Salah, maybe it's a Mane, whoever it might be this year, yes, you can take them out to another player and try and get more points and then put them back in. But ultimately, if you're telling yourself when you make that transfer, at some point very soon, I'm going to have to get this player back in, they're probably not worth a transfer out. These players don't have to score points every single week, but the ones that you know are consistently going to score points, tick over, like maybe it'll be a blank, then it'll be a clean sheet, then it'll be an attacking return, then it'll be a clean sheet, then it'll be another blank. Players like that, you don't need to keep transferring in and out. There's probably better ways you can spend that transfer. Maybe look at a different defender, a cheap one that's not going to pick you up many points, so you swap them to a different cheap one. Maybe it's an £8 million midfielder, there's another one with better fixtures coming up. But someone like Trent Alexander-Arnold, or maybe even some of the big hitters like Salah potentially this season, they don't need most of the time transfers out. There'll always be situations when it happens, but ultimately for most of the season you are going to keep these players for a lot of it. So for me, it's don't waste transfers. If they've been consistent performers, there's probably no reason why that's going to stop. For someone like Trent, sometimes if it's like a cheap £6 million striker, yes, maybe you'll change them out for the fixtures, but ultimately you just want them ticking over. A bit like goalkeepers, don't waste your transfers on players like these. So this one kind of ties in with the last one about don't waste transfers, but it's don't force players out. Now I do this all the time, and it's something I really need to stop. If a player's not performing well, the first reaction is we have to get rid of them. Now, of course, if a player's not doing well, maybe their underlying stats aren't very good, the team isn't performing that they're playing for or something like that, of course, we can look to get them out. The question, though, should always be, is there a better option? Is this the right time to be making this transfer? Is there something else that I can do better? So one thing that springs to mind from last season, Danny Ings, he was about to play Watford away. I decided that it was time to transfer him out. He hadn't scored many points in a couple of weeks before, and I didn't think he was performing that well. And I brought in a player I didn't even necessarily need to get a bit of money, which I didn't need to spend that week. And I took him out, and Danny Ings continued to do well, and I had to bring him back in. So I had to use another transfer, not only to take him out, but to bring him back in. And I think this happens a lot. So I don't know, let's say you've got a £6.5 million forward. Yes, they haven't scored for 2 or 3 weeks. You have to start looking at things like underlying stats. What fixtures do they have coming up? Everyone will tell you it's form over fixtures, but sometimes, you know what? People don't score because they've just played tough fixtures, and then when they have an easy run coming up, that can easily change. So for me, let's say I've got one transfer, my £6 million forward hasn't scored for a few weeks. I've got no money to upgrade them. So the first question is, should I take someone else out just to afford this transfer? Sometimes that'll work, but then you've got to ask yourself, why are you taking out that more expensive price player? Have they been performing badly? And if, let's say, you've got Mitrovic start of the season, he's not performing for the first few weeks, you might be tempted to go to like Ayew or Bamford or whoever it might be, Che Adams at Southampton. That's all well and good, but have they been performing as well? If you've not got the money to upgrade, sometimes it's best just to leave those players. If in doubt, if you're not 100% sure, you feel like you've got to force them out, but you're not 100% sure, I would always wait and maybe get that second transfer. Next week, perhaps they've scored. Perhaps you've now got an easier way to upgrade them. You can take some money out from somewhere else without taking a hit. But ultimately, I think I do this a lot. I get tunnel vision. I decide that I don't want a player anymore, and I will look at all the different ways I can take them out rather than thinking about, is it the right time to take them out, and is that the best way to take them out? And if it's not, chances are you should probably just leave them in your team. So some of this also ties in with the mistakes to avoid video I did, but ignore ownership. I actually feel that I do quite a good job at this these days, but I need to carry that on into next season. For anyone watching this looking to maybe pick up some tips, I would 100% do this. Too often, it can basically be why you make a decision. Like, people subconsciously, they look at it and they think, well, I'm not letting ownership take a hold of my transfer decisions, but it does. Subconsciously, it does. If you're always checking what a player's ownership is, that's gonna basically skew your decisions at times. So a big example before the fixtures came out, I've talked about before, Kevin De Bruyne is 60%, Sterling 10%. Now, a lot of people will tell you, in order to keep up with the ranks and in order to not fall behind, you should get Kevin De Bruyne. And there's some merits to that. Of course, if you've got De Bruyne, and so does, like, you know, over 50% of the FPL population or FPL managers, of course, if he does badly, they're all going to do badly as well. But that's not the way to be thinking about FPL. You should be thinking about how to get the most points. Man United, for example, I'm not writing Bruno off as an option, not in any kind of shape or form. He'll probably be the highest owned Man United player going into kind of game week 2, game week 3. If I don't think that he's the best value for money, if I think it's Greenwood or Martial or Rashford instead, they're the players that I'm going to get. Because if they do really well and Bruno doesn't, and I've backed myself, then of course I'll climb up the ranks. So I would really ignore ownership when you can. Yes, there's times to take it into account. Maybe the end of the season when you do need a differential, you can start looking at it. But start of the season, like if I go and look at my draft right now, I've got no idea about who's owned by who. I could have a good guess about who's highly owned, but specific percentages, I just wouldn't know, and I would not make my choices. Liverpool, for example, if I think Trent's a better option than Robertson and Salah's a better option than Mane, I do not care less that they're higher owned than the other two. It just doesn't matter. So for me, try and ignore ownership. It shouldn't be something that dictates your transfers. Ultimately, and it sounds simple, but people ignore it, you pick the players that you think are going to score the most points. Don't worry about who everyone else has. So always in game week 1, I try and start with known quantities. Now, don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean just getting players with high ownership, as I've just said, but players that I think are going to perform well because either they've performed well in the past or they've come into the league from another good side, another good league with good numbers as well. So although I don't necessarily trust Salah with his new haircut, he is someone over the last 3 seasons scored over 200 points, a lot of goals for Liverpool. Liverpool best side in the league last year. They're going to score a lot more goals again this season. And you'd imagine that Salah will be at the forefront of that. Maybe it'll be Mane, and obviously if you think Mane is the better option, then of course you should go for him. But for me, players like Salah, Aubameyang, who always performs against kind of weaker sides, he's got 2 starting up, he'll probably be in my side as well. Werner, now this is where some people think known quantities means they have to have played in the league last year. For me, Werner's come from a pretty good side in a pretty good league with some pretty good numbers into a team that's pretty good and has made lots of transfers to become even better. For me, he's then a known quantity. What's not a known quantity would be someone like Bamford, who's come up from Leeds, got tough fixtures to start. We don't know exactly how Leeds are going to perform. Maybe it's Pereira from West Brom, right? And I'm not saying I would 100% ignore these players or that you should either. Obviously, you should make your own decisions. But for me, I would always limit the amount of those players that I have in my team. Like when I think of my draft right now, we've got Werner, Salah, Aubameyang, who I've already mentioned. Trent's obviously decent. A 4.5 million goalkeeper usually works out. I've got some Wolves defenders in there that always get clean sheets, one of the best defences in the league last year. So there's players like that. Son, okay, post-lockdown, maybe he wasn't as good as Kane, but for most of the time, he's a decent pick. Spurs probably going to do quite well again this season. Players like that will be in my side. I wouldn't take too many punts of players that haven't performed before. Their price has gone up way too high to what their actual points potential is. New players to the league from like, I don't know, I don't want to say weaker leagues, but the Bundesliga is quite comparable to the Premier League, I would say. And also who are posting good numbers in other leagues. That's always important as well. And I would always kind of limit the amount of championship players I have. Not saying I would ignore them completely, not saying I'll never bring them in, because of course I would if they're doing really well. But when it comes to game week 1, I'll always start mostly with known quantities. Number 6, 0 captaincy punts, right? So this is basically captain a player because what if they do well? That would be really good. Like we hear that thinking all the time. I've got a feeling about this player. Well, you can't just have a feeling. If you do, it's probably based on something. When people say that quite a lot, they'll say, I've got a feeling. It's usually because maybe subconsciously they've seen them perform well. They know the opposition they're about to play isn't that good. They know the underlying stats are good. Something like that. They might say, I've got a feeling. Fair enough if subconsciously you've had to think about it. But generally, if you're just plucking a player out of thin air because it would be great if they did something, that's probably not the right captaincy call to make. So for me, again, I'll always choose known quantities. Aubameyang against Fulham, game week 1. Aubameyang against West Ham, game week 2. Maybe Salah against Leeds, game week 1. At home, Salah's usually a bit of a banker when it comes to points. Players like this, I'm not going to start looking at, I don't know, Brighton strikers or Fulham, like Mitrovic, for example. Mitrovic might do really well as a £6 million forward. He could be in my team for the whole season. He might tick over with a few goals here or there, maybe the odd assist, the odd penalty or something like that. Will he ever be a captain shout for me? Probably not. Not in the slightest. And there'll be times when I miss out. I had Antonio last season, for example, against Norwich, where he scored 4 goals. Not once did I think about him for captaincy. And obviously, if I did, it would have been huge. But as good as his stats were, he's not someone that I would usually have captained before, so I wouldn't have taken a bit of a punt on that. Those that did obviously did really well. And again, I'm not saying you should never do this if that's your play style, but for me, for my tips to try and get a better season than last year, it's got to be 0 captaincy punts. Number 7, don't judge the outcome. Now, this is really important, and again, something that I don't do often enough, and I know other people don't do often enough either, and that's judging what happened from a decision that you made, right? Not every decision that you make in FPL, I mean, it's football after all, right? I like stats as much as the next person, expected goals and all this stuff. But even the best stats people, like the ones you should really follow about it, they will tell you it's football. Sometimes crazy things happen. Sometimes a team has 20 shots, the other team has 1 shot, and that team that had the 1 shot wins 1-0. They play that game over and over again. The team with 20 shots probably wins, but it doesn't always work out like that. And that's where, when you make a decision and it doesn't work out, or even sometimes when it does, you need to think about what your original thought process was for that. So again, if you're going to say to yourself, this player hasn't performed well, the team haven't performed well, I've got a feeling that he's going to start performing right now. And if you've got no real reason for that, like there's not something that you've seen, maybe there's not been a transfer in or whatever it might be, then if that doesn't pay off, that was probably a bad decision. If I look at the underlying numbers, I don't know, let's say it's a Martial, I see that he's not scored any goals in the last 4 matches, but he's got an expected goals of 3. And he's someone that usually performs quite well in relation to his expected goals, then I can probably say to myself, he's been a bit unlucky not to score. He's got Fulham, West Ham, Leicester coming up in the next 3 fixtures. He's probably a good pick to come in. I've compared him to the other £9 million strikers, and I think he's the best bet. In that scenario, if he then plays those 3 games and still doesn't score, you've probably been a bit unlucky. Obviously, there might be other circumstances why that's happened. Again, you'd have to process that as and when it does happen. But ultimately, you've got a good striker and a good team that has been performing well. It just hasn't been converted into FPL points. That was probably a good decision. If you just say, got a feeling this guy will start doing well, hasn't done well for the last 20 games, but why not? Now's his time. And he doesn't do well, that's probably a bad decision. It definitely is something, because the good thing about this is if you can do this, it will stop you raging about stuff that's out of your control. Like if you triple captain Mane last year like me, and he got injured, triple captaining Mane in that double game was not a bad decision. It was just unlucky. If I triple captain, I don't know, Wijnaldum or whoever it might have been, that's a bad decision because quite often in that Liverpool team, he just doesn't score. So don't judge the outcome. You've got to almost just judge your kind of thought process. Did you get that right? If you did, sometimes you're just going to get unlucky. Number 8, give hits a lot of thought. Now, I'm kind of in the middle about hits. Like some people hate them, some people love them. I'm somewhere in the middle. I think they do have their place. I don't think you should go into a season saying I'm not going to take any hits this year. I think FPL is all about adapting and being flexible to different situations. Sometimes you're going to need a hit. Maybe you've got 2 injuries. Maybe you've got 2 players that you made a bad decision on that you need to get rid of. Again, thinking about everything else I talked in the video, should they 100% be going? If they do, maybe you need a hit for that. But this kind of ties in again with everything else. If you're taking a hit out for a player out, obviously there's 2 players involved, at least, sometimes 3, depending on how many hits you're taking. You've got to look at those players individually and then see how many points you think they're going to score for the next 3 or 4 weeks. Because I'll tell you now, if you're taking hits for players to get 1 week scores, like a good score in 1 week, it's very hard to do that time and time again. Sometimes you get it right. Sometimes there might be a double game week where it's worthwhile doing. But if you're going into game week 2, right, I'm going to take a hit, this player's going to score really well, then I'm going to take another hit, get a different player in game week 3. It's very difficult to do that. Usually when you bring in a player, you're bringing them in for like 3, 4, 5, 6 game weeks and hoping that over the average of that time, they get a good score. If you're just bringing in a player every week for a hit, probably not going to work out. So in my opinion, and what I'm going to be doing this year, if I'm taking a hit, I have to look at the 2, 3, 4 players that I'm taking out and obviously the players that I'm bringing in. Do I really think those 2 players are going to outscore them? Am I taking out a consistent performer? Am I taking someone out that's performing well from an underlying stats point of view? Am I taking someone out that's got good fixtures? Are the team performing well? All these questions you'd be asking yourself when you take a hit. If you just had a bad game week, you're like, right, I need to get rid of some of these players, I'm going to take hits. That's probably not a bad, or that probably is a bad decision, or it's going to be a bad decision. I guess this tip isn't on the list, but it kind of, again, ties in with this because I'm talking about rage transfers. If on the weekend you have a bad game week, my advice would always be, do not make a transfer decision that same night. At least give it 1 night's sleep and then see if you feel the same in the morning. Or if even better, give it 2, 3, 4 nights, then see if you still want to make that same decision. Because sometimes you'll look at your team, you'll see everyone else on Twitter or wherever you kind of hang out on social media posting really good scores. Yours will seem bad, your players will look bad, and you'll want to get rid of all of them. But when you get to like Thursday, Friday, sometimes your head has kind of cleared a bit, and taking that hit might not seem as good as it did at the weekend. So do give them a lot of thought. And in general, any transfer decision, kind of captaincy decision and stuff like that, try and give it a bit of time after a bad game, because that will make things seem better, even if they're maybe not all the time. So that's it for this video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Let me know what you think about the tips that I've talked about. And also jump into the comments below. Let everyone else know what your #1 tip is. It's going to be a bit of a conversation between the Let's Talk FPL community. If there's something I've missed that you've maybe learned from previous seasons, get it down below. Get involved in the conversation. If you have enjoyed the video, please do give it a like. Much appreciated as always. Let's hit another 1,000 likes on this video if we can. And I just want to say once again, I know I keep banging on about it, but thanks very much to everyone that has subscribed either when I first started the channel, in between, or recently to the channel. 75,000 subscribers is absolutely insane. It feels like the last big milestone before we hit that 6-figure 100,000 subscribers. And honestly, I couldn't obviously do it without you. I need you guys to be watching. Loads of support on this channel. It really has. Like, just over the last 3 years, it's been amazing, and obviously we're going to grow this into something huge and huge and huge and just get it bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you haven't already hit subscribe, if you're one of those people that sees my videos on the home screen, clicks them all the time, but doesn't hit subscribe, just do it for me. Really help me out, and I'd be much appreciated as always. Otherwise, I'm going to shut up now. Leave those comments below, and I will catch you tomorrow for another FPL video. Cheers all.